Do you have a sense that the thing we've been talking about, the increase in censorship, does that predate Xi Jinping? Is Xi Jinping a part of that increase in censorship? Like, what is that dynamic? What role does Xi Jinping play in what China has gone through over the past, let's say, a decade and a half?
That's a really great question. I was actually just writing a review of two books. One is called The Xi Jinping Effect, which was just a bunch of scholars, an academic volume, sort of looking at take this topic and that topic. How much is Xi Jinping as a person really affected it? And they come up with all kinds of answers. But there's a book I really like. Emily Fang of NPR has a new book out called "Let Only Red Flowers Bloom," and what she talks about the changes in China as she was covering it from the mid 2010s on was, and I think this really is Xi Jinping's one of his imprimaturs on the country, is there's a narrowing of spaces available for variations of ways of being Chinese within the country. And this goes against the grain of a pattern in the sort of post Tiananmen period of allowing more space for sort of civil society, but also allowing sort of way Muslims felt that they didn't have to choose between being, their Muslim identity and their Chinese identity. But there's more and more of a kind of we see this in Xi Jinping becoming impatient with Hong Kong, where there was a way of which, okay, this is a city that's part of the PRC, but it really operates very differently. He seems to be uncomfortable with difference, I guess, he's not alone in strongmen this way of sort of wanting to impose a kind of singular vision of what Chinese identity means, what loyalty to the status quo means. And so there's been a kind of tightening of controls over all the borders. And even one thing she reported on was Mongolia and Inner Mongolia. It had been seen as an unproblematic kind of frontier area. And who cares if there was some revival of Mongolian language? But under Xi, there's been a less patience with those kinds of difference. There's been more of a resurgence of patriarchy. All kinds of things have happened under him. But how much is it just him, or how much is it also a kind of mood or group within the party? Some of these trends, I think, began before he took power in late 2012. I think really my own feeling going to China fairly often from the mid 1990s till about 2018 was that until 2008, the year of the Olympics, each trip it would feel like, oh, there's just more space, there's more breathing room for, it's not becoming a liberal democracy, but I would notice things that felt like I'm surprised that happens. That people felt less worried about what they were saying and what they were doing. Um, that kind of trend line up until about 2008, but from the Olympics and then the financial crisis after that, the Chinese Communist Party felt, I guess, more. It's still insecure, but it felt cockier in some ways, and you had like, okay, maybe we can start asserting more control over things. So I think that's been stronger under Xi Jinping's time in power. And he was already the designated successor by 2008. He was in charge of security for the Olympics, and the Olympics was supposed to be a moment possibly of more opening up, because when Seoul hosted the Olympics, South Korea became a less tightly controlled right-wing dictatorship and moved toward democracy. And some people were hoping the Olympics might move China that way, and it went quite the opposite.
You mentioned that we don't know the degree to which this change has to do with Xi Jinping or the party apparatus. And that question, going back to Confucius of hierarchy and how does the power within this very strict one-party state work? What can we say? What do we know about the structure of this Communist Party apparatus? How much internal power struggle is there? How much power does Xi Jinping actually have Is there any insight we have into the system?
So James Palmer, who worked in Beijing as a journalist and now is an editor at Foreign Policy, wrote an important piece a few years ago about just we should really be straight about what a black box the Chinese elite politics are, and really not try to pretend we know more than we do. We did used to have more of a sense of these kind of ideological factions, but also partly about different views of how much tinkering there should be with the economy and things like that. And they were also partly based on personalities and personal ties. But we did have a sense you could sort of map out these kinds of rival power bases and things. And we just have much less of a sense of that under Xi Jinping. It's very hard to know, other than this sort of small group around him, how it works. We don't have a major defector who says, yeah, this is how Xi Jinping. We have Xi Jinping's self-presentation and a lot of things that are then said about him. There were some false expectations about him that some people thought, oh, he's going to be a reformer because his father was a liberalizing figure, and that doesn't work that way. And he does seem to care about orderliness. He does seem to care about certain things. He wants to present himself as a kind of scholarly figure in touch with China's deep past. We know he's a strong nationalist and a kind of cultural nationalist as well as political nationalist. But beyond that, we don't have that much of a sense of what makes him tick. We get little hints. There was a secret speech where he talked about that leaked out that he talked about how the Soviet Union had collapsed because the leadership didn't pay enough attention to ideology. And he also said that none of them were manly enough to keep control. So I imagine if he and Putin ever have a kind of heart-to-heart conversation, one thing they'd find to agree on is this sort of distaste for Gorbachev. This feeling that Gorbachev was the wrong way to do things.
Not manly enough?
Yeah, not strong enough about, really keeping control. And, for Putin, it would be that it led to the Soviet Union, to the loss of an empire. But for Xi Jinping, there is a bit of being haunted by what happened to the Soviet Union. And I'm not going to be the leader who sees the diminishment of this landmass that was, in a sense, rebuilt over time for Mao and then Deng Xiaoping. You have the story, a very powerful story about the Chinese past that the Chinese Communist Party makes a lot out of. But that Chiang Kai-shek, the Nationalist Party, who was Mao's great rival, also made a lot out of, and that has a partial basis in fact, was that from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, China, which had been this strong force in the world, got bullied and nibbled away at by foreign powers. And it's important to realize there are elements of that story that are very true. And the answer they had is that under my watch, that's not going to happen. And the reason why my party deserves to rule is because it can reassert China's place in the world. And both the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party predicated themselves on this kind of nationalistic story of being in a position to prevent that from happening again.
This is a bit of a tricky question, but is it safe for journalists, for folks who write excellent books about the topic, to travel to China?
I think there are all kinds of different things about safety or not. I think until recently, at least, the people who were most vulnerable were people of Chinese descent, people originally from China who had gone abroad and coming back, or even people who were, Chinese Americans who went there. There was a higher sort of expectation that they should be on board. So you had early cases. My friend Melissa Chan was an early person kicked out when she was working for Al Jazeera and reporting on Xinjiang. So that's one kind of person who was vulnerable because of this expectation that they should be somehow more loyal. Another kind of person who was vulnerable, or in this case, more likely to be blocked from China, the Communist Party is particularly concerned about people from outside of China who are amplifying the voices of people within China or exiles from China who the government would like to silence. So the Dalai Lama, you had scholars who worked on Tibet and had connections to the Dalai Lama, were early people to have trouble going to the PRC. Then scholars who worked on Xinjiang and were connected to Uyghurs. But there also were people who were sort of personally connected to dissidents or exiles who would amplify their voices, would translate their work, would promote them. That then it wasn't about necessarily danger if you got in China, but you were more likely to be denied a visa if you were the kind of person who was doing that. So I wrote critical op-eds about the Chinese Communist Party. I published them in some high-profile places. I've written a lot about Tiananmen, wrote about human rights issues, all that, and I kept getting visas to go to China. I testified to a Congressional Executive Joint Committee on China about the Tiananmen protests on the 25th anniversary of it, and some people said, oh, that's the kind of thing that would lead to you not getting a visa. I got a visa right after that. Now I think it might be different. Now some of these expectations have been changed. There have been people who've been very surprisingly gotten in trouble. These two Canadians who were clearly, it was a kind of tit for tat, partly because of tech mavens relative being held in Canada. So it was kind of there. It was also not picking a fight with Americans. But there were certain kinds of things that you could map out what was the riskiest thing to do. And so I went in the 2010s, having written, you know, forcefully about Tiananmen, and I didn't feel dangerous. I mean, I felt there was an awareness in some cases of what, if I was giving a public talk, there was awareness of what it was. There was sometimes you didn't want to get your host who had brought you to a university in trouble by saying something that would get them in trouble. I think it was often that the you were more vulnerable if you were within China or you were connected to China in different ways. For me, it's been confusing these last few years. I wrote one piece about this, about I'm not going to any part of the PRC for the time being. But I always thought that Hong Kong was a place that I'd be free to go, even if things got difficult. I didn't get a visa for the mainland. You didn't need a visa for Hong Kong. But with Hong Kong, with the mainland, I had kept a kind of distance from the dissidents that I was writing about. With Hong Kong, I felt that these rules kind of didn't apply, and I was more connected to them, more friends with some of them. And then with this crackdown that's come on Hong Kong, and there are exiles from Hong Kong who have bounties on their heads. And so now I feel that, it's not necessarily that anything would happen to me if I went to Hong Kong, but I feel I would be very closely watched. And so I wouldn't want to meet with some of my friends there who aren't this high profile. So I don't want to go to a place where I would feel that I was toxic in some way.
Right. One, you're walking on eggshells, and two, you can get others in trouble. That kind of dynamic is complicated. So it's fascinating that Hong Kong is now part of that calculus. So I've gotten the chance to speak to a bunch of world leaders. Do you think it's possible that I would be able to do an interview with Xi Jinping?
If you do, I would be very pleased because I could watch that interview and get some insights about Xi, which have been very hard to get. I mean, they're really difficult. There have been very few discussions. He doesn't give press conferences. There's a variety of things, and this is different from some of his predecessors. Jiang Zemin famously was interviewed by Barbara Walters and asked about Tiananmen, and he tried to make out that it wasn't a big deal. There are a variety of things, but he had relatively spontaneous conversation. I was going to say, he's the only Chinese leader I've met, but I met him before he was a major, major leader. He was the party secretary or mayor of Shanghai. And it matters because the party secretary is the more important role. But anyway, he just met with a group of foreign scholars who were going over to Shanghai in '88 for a conference on Shanghai history. And just to show you the limits of anybody who thinks they can predict what's going on in Chinese politics, predictability is just very hard in general in the world. But I think the consensus among us, and these were some of the most knowledgeable foreign scholars on China, was this was somebody who really had probably topped out because he was meeting with us. He must not be heading anywhere up. And then after Tiananmen, he becomes the top leader in China. But he had a kind of, you could pick things out from being in a room. He liked to kind of show off his kind of cosmopolitanism. Xi Jinping gives these speeches about all the foreign authors he likes and has read, but it's all very kind of scripted, at least in his own head too. It's very carefully done to present a certain image of himself, and we really don't get many senses of what he's like in unguarded moments or has them. And sometimes we get the illusion of them. Like there was an image of him and Obama in their shirt sleeves at the Sunnylands meeting, and the photo would show them walking and talking, but there's no translator in the image, and so you're like, how are they talking? What language are they using? How is this, or is it just a kind of? I mean, of course, there are exchanges with top leaders, and Trump will say they're friends or these kinds of things, or there's a language of Xi Jinping can talk about somebody or some country being friend, but we don't have a sense of these kinds of the what makes him tick as a person. So maybe you should ask him about Ernest Hemingway and see if he really gets excited about him, because in the kind of generic things he talks about all these, you can feel him sort of ticking things off about, oh yes, I'm glad to be in England, the country of Shakespeare, and this, and he goes off these set things. But Hemingway, there's some sense that, he had some special feeling, which fits in with some of the macho side to him. That would be. Interestingly, he doesn't mention Orwell as one of his favorite British authors as much. He says he likes Victor Hugo a lot.
Hmm.
And that became a little tricky because Do You Hear the People Sing from Les Miserables became one of the one of the protest songs in Hong Kong. And how do you get in this position where and actually Victor Hugo is a, a rare Western author who's had a pretty steadily positive image in China, even under periods of criticism of, like, all Western authors problematic, because Victor Hugo famously wrote a statement denouncing the European destruction of the old summer palace in Beijing in 1860, the end of the Second Opium War. He said, how can we claim to be civilized when we've destroyed one of the great creations of civilization? So that kind of made him a kind of long-term friend to the Chinese nation. Mark Twain has had a pretty good reputation because he was a critic of American imperialism. So, but anyway, I think if you do get to talk to Xi Jinping, talk to him about Ernest Hemingway and Victor Hugo, and I'll be curious to see if those were the ones who really resonated.
One of the things, and it's a strange thing that I've become aware of, having spoken with world leaders, I'm distinctly aware that there's a real possibility that the black box we mentioned, that the Communist Party of China will listen to the words I'm saying now. And so I have to wonder how much that affects my possible tourist-like trip to China, because there's a difference between sort of an influencer that does fun things, plays video games, and goes over to China, and somebody that actually covers China to some degree, whether critical or supportive or nuanced or any kind of way, in the full spectrum of ideas you can have about China, including Chinese history, whether that's going to be seen uh, carefully, analyzed carefully, and have repercussions when you travel. So and because of the black box nature, and because it's, for me personally, just a culture that's very different than anything I'm familiar with, it makes me a bit nervous.
It's certainly gotten harder for journalists to operate in China. That there was a way in which now journalists will look back to, the early 2000s, and it was really quite extraordinary what they could do. Well, you have a lot of listeners. I mean, I think there isn't that tight a watching of what an academic writes about the Chinese Communist Party, but there are certain things that clearly are kind of tightly policed, and one is discussions of the private life of Chinese leaders and their families, and issues of kind of really following money trails for corruption and things like that. So there was the case of the Hong Kong booksellers who were kidnapped, and one of them is still in a Chinese prison. He would be a good example of this, Gui Minhai, the kind of person who was vulnerable. He was born in China. He was actually he is a Swedish citizen, and he was spirited out of Thailand into the mainland. And the reason why he was on the radar of the Communist Party was because the publishing house in Hong Kong that he was connected to was publishing works about the top tier of the Chinese Communist Party and contradicting the kind of vision of them as a certain kind of moral exemplars. And that's different from writing things about China has a bad human rights record or something like that in ways like I did. These were books that were exposés, or sort of some of them kind of gossipy and lightly sourced, some of them much more serious, but they were about something that the Communist Party leadership wants to make a no-go zone. And I've thought sometimes that Xi Jinping seems to have lèse-majesté envy. But I don't think it's kind of general criticisms of the Chinese Communist Party as a authoritarian um, structure or place that doesn't deserve to rule in kind of very general terms. I don't think that's something that they then pick you up at the border and say, "Oh, no, we can't let that person in," because people are let in. And it's not rational. It's not a rational process. There are people who've been denied visas. It seems pretty inexplicable. There are things that now I think the rules are changing very quickly all over the world for kinds of what's safe to say and do.
Well, either way, I do know that the Communist Party and likely Xi Jinping himself watched my conversation with Prime Minister Modi. They responded to it. And I do hope, and I will definitely go to China. And I hope to talk to Xi Jinping. It's a fascinating, historic, ancient culture, and is the major player on the world stage in the 21st century. And it would be fascinating to understand the mind of the leader of that great superpower.